All right, so now what we're going to move on to is something simple because it's a variation of what we just did, which is some of the plants in here that have even broader leaves. So we can see there's that one right there. I can see some broad leaves right there. So there's a few of them. And I also can see I also have some really tall ones. So it's mixed in with all the other plants, but that's a little bit easier. See those tall, long ones that are coming out with the leaf on the end? So let's take a look at those. So going into Maya, I have the scene open, and this is one of them. I made two, one that's shorter, and then one that has much longer branches with a different type of leaf on it. So this one we can see is also started from the stroke palm leafy, so the same preset that I used before. So the only difference really is that I made the twigs and branches longer. I made the leaves shorter, and that's about it. This is something that I do sometimes where if I'm already working on a scene like I am with this forest path, I want to sometimes make my plants to scale. And so I work usually in real world units. And so that forest path scene is in real world units. And so basically what I do is I create a cube and I set it to 180 centimeters tall, which is like the height of a person, a tall person. And so basically this tells me like here's a person that's about 6 feet tall. And so it gives me a point of reference when I'm making these plants of how big I want them to be when I import them into my scene. So that's just a useful thing to do. And then as far as these guys go, if we take a look at the stroke for them, so display, show, selection, and let me hide these guys. And I can hide that. And here comes another helicopter. Let it pass. Then let's take a look at the preset. So what did I do inside here? Well, basically, if we look around and close things, or just scroll around, I can see I've got branches, twigs, and leaves, just like the spider plants we were making. But if I scroll up to creation, you can see that the length, min, and max values are a lot higher, which means I made the branches longer. So if you remember, these were around like 0.1 and 0.3 before, or something like that. So meaning that the length of the branch was much, much shorter. And so I've given it longer branches. And then I also have made the twigs longer. And so the twig length, you can see inside here, I adjusted. I only have one twig in cluster, so one twig is coming at a time on the branch, but I do have 5 potential clusters. And I have 4 branches, so if I put that to 2, 3, 10. So obviously when you're using branches, you can see that they're all coming from the same branch point. So that's where I might lower that down and decide, well, I actually want to do it with more twig clusters inside here. And I can lower the dropout. So we didn't use or talk about dropout earlier, but dropout just means a certain percentage of the twigs are deleted. And so it's nice, it can add a nice sort of random look to things by having a high dropout, so they're not all exactly the same. So, but if I want more density, I can lower that down a little bit. And then from before, our leaves were a lot longer. So you can see here if I lowered or increased the leaf length, but adjust the width down, they start to look more, and here comes an airplane. Sorry for the air traffic that we're having right now, but it's getting warm outside and I got the window open just for air and breathing. And a plane's flying by. Sorry, I'm distracted. Okay, so you can see this is starting to look more like the other thing, just with long twigs. So make them a little bit shorter. And we're back to what I've got. Here we can see again the fact that the curl is different on this leaf than this leaf, but we know that'll change when I convert it to poly. And so this is a very common type of plant where you have these long stems with a shorter leaf at the end. So from our preset, so easy to make this variation. Twigs longer, leaves shorter. And then obviously we can see I have the curl adjusted so that it curls more at the base than it does at the tip. And that's just our curl inside there. So I could adjust the curl at the tip. I could have it curl the other way at the tip. So we get something like that. Or just back to how I liked it, which was around something like that. And then here I've made them a little bit too wide. And that's pretty much this plant. So no reason to create it from scratch because it would get redundant. It's too similar to the other ones that we made. And so basically I've got this one, which if I get my scale reference in here, we can see it looks like so. And so this one was the shorter one, which means that if I go to twigs, twig length, shorten those twigs down a little bit. So I've got this short plant, or relatively short compared to the person. And then if I want to mess around with the seed value and just see the variations I can get off of that. And then if I choose to duplicate this stroke, duplicate input graph, I'll hide that one. And then on this one, I want the twigs to be much longer. So I'll go to my twigs and increase the length of those, but then maybe lower their stiffness down, or rather increase the stiffness so they're a little bit more vertical. So this one is a lot taller. So a short one and a tall one. And then for the taller ones, if I go to my leaves, we can see that I have width scale so that they're getting, changing shape along it. If I delete all that, then I can choose in here to have them be square if I just want to use a texture with an alpha channel on these. And then these leaves inside here look fine. So now what I'll do is I'll get this one visible. And so let's convert this guy to poly. Modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. And let's convert this one. Modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. And let's get these to be hidden. So I've got these two different plants. One that's a little shorter and one that's a little taller. And so for the one that's shorter, I actually have a leaf shape on it, so I can apply a texture to it that doesn't have an alpha channel. While this one, being square, I can just use a leaf texture that does have an alpha channel. So even obviously if the leaf shape does have a shape to it, you can still use an alpha channel on it. It's just going to warp your texture a little bit, which can actually look fine. So if we open Hypershade and this scene, and I go to these guys, so I'm going to say, well, for the branches, leafy frond branch, so I'll assign that, which is this texture going along the branch. So it's just a green branch that gets a little brown at the end. And then for the leaves, if I graph what I have, you can see it's the same texture that I had from before, but on these leaves. So it's a 3 by 3. So what I'll do is I'll use that on both of them for now. So I'm going to assign that one. And then that means in Hypershade, I can also choose to delete unused. So we just have that, simplifying our scene. I need to run my UV script on the leaves. So now if I select them and go to the UV texture editor, that's in a 3 by 3. This just doesn't have enough leaves to fill it. And so I could render this out, see what these look like. And obviously the ones that I made square are going to look a little funny. because they're going to be completely square leaves. But we can see the ones that have a shape to them make sense. So I want to use a different texture for the ones that are square. So I'm going to go into Hypershade. I'll graph my leaf, and then I'm going to duplicate that shading network and put that on the taller ones. But for this one, I'm going to use something that has an alpha. And so I'm going to go in here and let me grab a texture. And the texture that I used in my scene was this leaf. So you can see this one I do have, you know, front and back and trans and all that kind of stuff. For a leaf that's bigger, especially if it's close to camera, you're going to want to make a better shader. But for now, let's just go in and say, I've got that one. It's not a 3x3 though, and so that means I need to set my placement node to 3x3. And then to make some adjustments in here to improve things on this shader. So basically, things in here are just a little wonky. So I'm going to go in and just make a couple changes so that I've got my color. So I just broke some connections. That's being gamma corrected, so 0.454. Then I'm going to create inside here another file texture. And this file texture I'm going to also gamma correct. And this will be the back of the leaf. So back color. And then put the effect to 0.1 for the filter. So that's going to go into that node, which will go into that node. Because again, this is the translucency, which is why it's being multiplied. And I do need to go and tile this one 3x3, so I'll delete that placement node and just share the same placement node. So now I've got that. And then for the bump on it, I need to make another file texture, which will go to the bump node. And for that, I already have, we can see inside here, a bump. And so this is just a grayscale version of the front color where I adjusted levels in Photoshop to give it some contrast. Put that to 0.1. And again, share the same placement node. I need to get the alpha channel of my color map used. I usually put the alpha channel for cutout opacity in the alpha of the front color. So I'm going to go in here and I know I need to invert it. And then I have to take this, which is going to be RGB, and make it grayscale. And so that's going to get connected to the reverse utility. So out transparency to input. That goes into value. And that goes into cutout opacity. So out value of the luminance node to cutout opacity. And then on my color node, under color balance, you can see it as alpha is luminance. I need to turn that off because I want it to not have the luminance value of the color become the out transparency. I want the actual alpha channel used. So sometimes if you're like, oh, why isn't my cutout opacity working? Sometimes it could just be that you have that on. So alpha is luminance is unchecked. And so now we have a different shader. I could also put that spec map that I have in there. So that's under reflection color. File texture, and I will grab the spec, which is very bright because I want it to be practically 1, or a value of 1, very close to it. And then again, share the same placement node. So now I've just made a shader that's a little bit more complicated, but the leaf will look better. And so that's assigned to this guy. If it displays as black in hardware, you need to go to the UV texture editor and just specify a file texture. So now you can see it looks normal. And then let's do another render. And then we'll see that those leaves look different. And so you can see it's got a nice curl. It's got 5 different leaves coming out of it. It kind of looks like little hands. But anyway, that's what I did for the forest scene. So if we look in Photoshop you can see here's one of these coming out with the 5 different branches of that texture on there. And you can see there's more of them right there. So you can see the texture on the branch where they're kind of green and then get like a little bit brown. So yeah. So in Hypershade, so this right here is the branch texture, really, really simple. So a color map, gamma corrected for translucency, multiplied, and that's the branch texture, while leafy frond, the one we just made, and then this guy, which is for the other ones that have a leaf shape. So whether you choose to have the shape of the leaf be in the geometry via paint effects, or whether you choose to make them square and have something with an alpha channel, that's up to you on the type of leaf that you're creating. So, but hopefully this has helped you see how I created 2 of the other plants that are in the scene. So just longer twigs and shorter leaves, and pretty simple. So let me go to Photoshop for a sec. So this one was pretty quick just because it was based on the spider plant preset and the palm leafy. So what we're going to move on to next is we have this ground cover that we need to talk about and ferns that we need to talk about, because that's pretty much it as far as plants that I made in here. So let's talk about the ground cover next, because that's simple compared to the ferns. So ground cover. And so let's move on to that.